Hi, I'm Jack Kramer. I'm an attorney. I've been practicing bankruptcy for about 25 years, and I'd like to go over a few of the things that happen in bankruptcy and kind of explain the process to you so that you have a good understanding of what it's all about and what the pros and cons are, and that'll maybe help you make a decision if you're thinking about filing bankruptcy. So, to start with, for most individuals, there are two types of bankruptcy that would be filed. There's the Chapter 7, which is the most common. It's called a liquidation. And then there's the Chapter 13. The Chapter 13 is useful mainly for people who are perhaps behind on payments to a house or a car, or perhaps they have a lot of assets that might be at risk in a regular Chapter 7. So, and I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail. But the Chapter 7, by and large, is the most common bankruptcy that people file. And that one's used to get rid of what is called unsecured debts. That would be things like credit card bills, medical bills, things of that nature. So, Chapter 7 is the one we file the most. Chapter 13 is certainly useful if you're in a situation where you're about to lose your home or car, something like that, and I'll go into a little more detail on that. But in either bankruptcy, there's just certain procedures that are followed when we file one, and I just want to cover what those are today. So the first thing is I sit with you for about an hour and I talk with you about the situations that are going on with you, what kind of debt you have, what kind of income you have, what kind of assets you have and what they're worth, and kind of what brought you to the bankruptcy or the consideration of bankruptcy in the first place. And just kind of get a little information from you because everybody's case is different, and I have to know this before I can really give you good advice, because depending upon what answers you give me, it's going to make a difference as to where I would point you. So let's just say typically for Chapter 7, most people will come in and they have a lot of credit card debt. Maybe they've had a car repossession, maybe they've had a lot of medical bills for whatever reason. And so I need to know what those debts are and approximately how much they are. And I have to know the exact number, but I need to get an idea. I need to know what kind of income you have, whether it's from Social Security disability or pension, or whether it's from your job, or whether you're self-employed. Approximately what your gross income is every month, and then after taxes and everything are taken out, get an idea of what you actually have left over to pay your bills with. And that helps me determine where we need to go. So in the bankruptcy laws that we have now in the United States, which were designed for people in bad situations, they're there to help people that really don't have the ability to pay their debts. And since there's not much to be gained by letting creditors beat up on people that really can't do anything about their situation, Congress passed the bankruptcy laws many, many years ago. And as they are now, there's certain procedures that have to be followed when someone files a bankruptcy. One of those is they want you to do some credit counseling courses, and those courses are designed to help you avoid problems in the future. So they just kind of give you information that maybe you haven't been aware of that might have helped you avoid having to do the bankruptcy in the first place. There's not much to them. They are courses that you can generally do online or over the phone. And primarily, like I say, it's just information relating to credit and good credit management that you're going to be talking with these people about. But it's not a difficult thing. They're not expensive. I think the cost to do them, it varies, but it's for the two courses total, it's usually under $50. And so that's one of the things that a person has to do prior to filing a bankruptcy. Secondly, I have to do what's called due diligence and look at your situation and make sure that you're eligible to file bankruptcy. Make sure you haven't had a discharge, for instance, in the last 8 years. Now, you may have filed another bankruptcy like a 13 or something that got dismissed, and that doesn't disqualify you. But if you've had a discharge from a bankruptcy in the last 8 years, then I need to look at what those dates are and do a little planning if we're going to go forward on that. So that's the whole point of the interview. But like I say, you do the credit counseling courses. I do the due diligence to make sure that you're eligible. and make sure that it's really the right thing for you to do. It might, bankruptcy typically solves a lot of problems for many, many people. And a lot of the satisfaction I get out of doing bankruptcy is the difference I see in people from the day they come to see me 6 months later when it's all over with, and the peace of mind it gives them. And that's a good feeling as a lawyer to see that transition, particularly with married couples that may be fighting a lot, maybe considering divorce. I'll often tell them, you might want to just wait till this is over with. You might feel differently when we get this problem solved. And that's another thing I like to mention to people as well. Financial problems are what I call fixable problems. And by that I mean, if you're in talking with your doctor and your doctor is telling you you have terminal cancer, for instance, and there maybe isn't anything they can do about it. Well, unfortunately, that's not a fixable problem for many people. So the point I like to make with that is that typically issues like you may be dealing with now with debt, those are fixable problems. And there are things we can do that will help you get a fresh start in life, help you start over, change your whole outlook on your future. And that's what's great about bankruptcy. It allows us to help people that are really in a really bad way, feeling really low, kind of get out of that hole and go on and have something to look forward to in life. So that's the whole purpose of bankruptcy. There are people that abuse the laws sometimes, but generally most of the people that file, they have very good reasons for doing so. Anyway, so there's the 7 bankruptcy, there's the Chapter 13 bankruptcy. One of the things I'll ask you about is what your assets are worth, and by that I mean your personal property. And the way I kind of sum that up is everything that would go on the moving van if you were moving tomorrow. That's all your personal property. Your furniture, your clothing, your jewelry, whatever you have, television, electronics, all that stuff, even pets. And when I ask you what its value is, I'm asking you for what you could sell it for to someone coming up your driveway if you were having a garage sale. That's what it's worth, because that's what it would sell for. Not what you paid for it, not what you'd like to get for it, but what it's actually worth. So people tend to overvalue their property when I talk with them until I explain that to them. Because they're thinking, well, let's see, if I sell that, what's it going to cost me to replace it? That's not what I want to know. I want to know, and think about it, if you have a television set, maybe you bought it a few years ago, and it was a very expensive TV set, but it's a few years old now, and someone coming up to look at it and buy it, electronics are kind of fickle. They don't know if it's going to work fine when they get it home, or maybe after it gets hot after an hour it's going to cut out. They don't know that. So the amount they're willing to pay is not what you would pay for a new one, obviously, or even one slightly used. So something to think about. But when I ask you for the value of your personal property, or any property, that's what I'm getting at. If I ask you about the value of your real estate, I want to know, what do you think you could sell it for today, realistically, okay? And the same with your car. And I'll tell you how you can go on and get appraisals of what your car is actually worth. But when we ask about the value, we're talking about what could you sell it for to someone that you were trying to sell it for in a Craigslist or something at this point. Because that's what it's worth, what someone's willing to pay you for. So don't overvalue your assets, I guess, is a point I'm making. Let's see. Talked about the means test. I did not talk about the means test. The means test is, they made some changes in the bankruptcy law several years ago. Whereas to qualify to do a Chapter 7, the one that's most common for people, you have to be under a certain income level. If you have over a certain amount of income, the way they look at it, they look at the IRS tax tables and dependents in your family and what the expenses should be, and they use that to determine whether someone qualifies to do a Chapter 7. And most people come and see me do, but they use a means test, and what it is they look at what your income and expenses are, your gross income, your area you live in, how many dependents you have, all of those things, and they determine whether or not you fall into the category based on the average of your last 6 months' income to do a Chapter 7. Now, You may have only recently lost your job, and you may have been making quite a bit of money when you did, and if you had come in to see me then, you may not have qualified. But if you've just been out of a job and you're going to be out of your job for a few more months, your income average for the last 6 is going to drop dramatically. And so you may have what I call a window of opportunity to discharge debt in a Chapter 7 that you might not have otherwise had because you didn't qualify to do it. So if you're or have been making a lot of income and you think this disqualifies you, well, we're gonna look at that, because it may well be that while you don't qualify today, you might qualify 2 months from today. So anyway, those are all things we'll be looking at. But there is a means test. I have to go through and do that as part of that due diligence I mentioned earlier. Time frame for bankruptcy. Typically, if we had all the paperwork together and we were ready to file your bankruptcy today, which I can do in a very short notice if I have to, but if we filed your bankruptcy today, here's what would happen. You would expect that about 5 or 6 weeks later, there would be a meeting that you and I would go to with a person called a trustee. And what happens there is that person asks you questions about your income, your expenses, the type of debt you have, and they may ask you just kind of what led up to you having to file bankruptcy or why you felt you need to file bankruptcy. And the meeting with these trustees is generally very brief. It's 5 minutes, 10 minutes tops generally. And the questions they ask you are questions I've already asked you. So I already know what your answers are going to be because I've already done all that. So I have no qualms about you going in there and discussing everything with the trustee, and you're required to do it anyway. But I have no problem with you going in there and answering all these questions. I know what you're going to say because we've already went over all that, and we've made sure that you are fully qualified to be where you're at. But that's what happens at that meeting. It's maybe 5 minutes long or 10 minutes long. And when it's over, that's about the only thing you'll have to do as far as attending any court appearances, anything like that. I, as your attorney, do the rest. There are some time limits that have to run generally. And approximately 3 months later, you would get your discharge in the typical Chapter 7, which gets rid of all the debt you have. They close the case out, and you go on with your life. So the typical time frame from the time we file until the case is over with and closed out is about 4.5 months on average. And during that time, it's mainly just a matter of waiting for the clock to run out, so to speak. There's certain time limits that are given for creditors to object to discharge, that type of thing, which is almost never happens, but they still have to let those time periods run. And oddly enough, the meeting that I just mentioned is what's called a 341 meeting of creditors. And the funny thing about it is, there's no creditors there. It's very rare. It's usually just you, me, and the trustee, and that's about it. The creditors have a right to come to that and question you about your finances, but they pretty much never do, because generally by the time a person gets to have filing the bankruptcy, I've already looked at their situation and determined that they qualify to do what they're doing. And if they, think that they could come to that meeting perhaps and change the fact that you're going to get a discharge, they may. But I think companies have come to realize that, listen, this person's qualified to get this relief, and there's not much point in us paying someone to go down there and sit for a half an hour and be told that they're not going to get anything. So generally there's never any creditors there. Sometimes there might be, if you have a finance car locally, sometimes from one of the credit unions, they might come with what's called a reaffirmation agreement to see if you want to sign that there, but they're not there for any reason other than to just facilitate that. And when I say reaffirmation agreement, what I'm talking about is, say you have a car or a home, or it might be some furniture or something, that you bought you may have bought it from a particular store and they have a security interest in it, or certainly generally when you have a car, they have a security interest in it. And you have the option of surrendering the car and being done with it if you want to, but very often people want to keep the car if it's, it's a good car and the payments are reasonable, the amount they owe is reasonable. And when you do that, we do what's called a reaffirmation. It's just essentially you're signing an agreement stating, listen, I know I can discharge this, but I believe I can afford it, and I think it's in my best interest to keep it, so that's what I want to do. And that kind of takes it out of the whole bankruptcy discharge circumstance. And so you will be allowed to keep the car as long as you keep making payments on it. But understand that a year or two down the road, if you default, you're going to still have a default on your record from that car because you took it out of the bankruptcy by doing the reaffirmation. As a general rule, that's never a problem because people only do it when they're sure they want to keep it. So anyway, that's what the few times that we see a creditor at a 341 meeting is generally about. Exempt assets. When you do a bankruptcy, there's a certain amount of assets that you're allowed to keep. And in Florida, generally you're allowed your homestead property, so you could own a home and have a lot of equity in it, and still it could be exempt from the whole bankruptcy process, so you don't need to worry about that. Let's say you have a 401k plan, or you have some money in an IRA. Those are entirely protected as well, so you needn't worry about pension plans, things of that nature. Those are protected. Life insurance cash values, those are protected. And in addition to that, there's also a certain amount of assets that you are allowed to keep, your personal property and a vehicle and things of that nature, a certain amount of equity in those, and I'll go into that in a little more detail. But that is property that you're allowed to keep and still go through the bankruptcy and get rid of the debt that you're dealing with. So I get into that in a little more detail, but those assets that I'm mentioning and the amount you're allowed to keep is determined by their value. So when I tell you what's the value of this, you don't want to overstate it. What can you sell it for? That's what I want to know. Reestablishing your credit. Generally, by the time someone comes to see me for a bankruptcy, their credit's already pretty bad. And if that's the case, the bankruptcy is probably going to help you get credit, because if you have all that debt and you haven't the ability to pay it, no one's going to give you more credit until you've dealt with that in some way, either paid it off or something. So by doing a bankruptcy and getting a discharge, you now have what they call a clean slate. You don't have any debt. I don't know how many people you can think of that you can actually say that, but generally not too many. You have no debt. You can't file a bankruptcy for another 8 years, as I mentioned earlier. So you're only allowed a discharge every 8 years, but you can't have another one after 8 years, but they got 8 years to chase you if you get some new credit and then you default on it. So you're actually at pretty good credit risk after you file a bankruptcy. Don't have any debt. Okay, so if they loan you money, they don't have to consider that you have other people that you have to pay back as well as them. It's just them. So you're a good credit risk. So you don't have any debt. You can't file bankruptcy for 8 more years, so they can chase you around for 8 years. And thirdly, you probably, if you're like most people, want to reestablish your credit. Maybe you say, I never want credit again. That's pretty common, but it's not a bad idea to reestablish it. You don't have to use it, but you can do things to reestablish your credit. And generally, you're going to find within a year of doing a bankruptcy, maybe even sooner, these companies are going to start soliciting you because they see through the credit bureaus who's filed bankruptcy and things of that nature, and they start sending you solicitations and getting car loans and mortgages and things in the future. Really, you're probably in a better position to do it than you are right now after you've done the bankruptcy, for what that's worth. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of what happens in a bankruptcy, and I hope that helps you understand the process. I might say a little bit more about the Chapter 13. Let's say that you are behind on your mortgage. Let's say you haven't made your mortgage payment in a year. And let's say the monthly mortgage payment is, just for sake of discussion, $1,000 a month. So now we know you're $12,000 at least behind, maybe a little more with late fees and all that other stuff. And they're foreclosing. You've been served a summons and they want to foreclose on your house. I can stop that right up until the sale. So even if you had a sale date tomorrow on your home, I can stop that. I mean, we can do things and get it stopped immediately. But it's always better to not wait until they have a sale. It's better to stop it before they even get the judgment, because depending upon how things go, we may need to, you know, buy additional time or something, and by them having a judgment, or not having a judgment, there's things I can do to kind of prolong how long it takes them to get to that point. But whatever the case is, if you're behind on your mortgage, we can file a Chapter 13, and what that allows you to do is put together essentially a payment plan. It's very similar to what you've probably heard of Chapter 11 reorganization for corporations. It's a reorganization for individuals. And let's say, as I described, you have a $12,000 deficit. So we put a plan together, and what the plan says is, okay, well, what we're going to do now is they're going to resume making the normal monthly payment, whatever it is, $1,000 a month, as we said. But in addition to that, we're going to take that $12,000 they're behind, and we're going to spread that out over the next 5 years to repay that. So $12,000, you spread that over 5. It's going to probably be something like, what, $200 a month, I'm guessing? 200 times 6, yeah, right around that. So you're going to make a plan payment that's going to be $1,000 for the normal house payment, plus an extra $200 a month for the monies that you're behind. And as long as you do that and you make the payments as you're supposed to, they will approve the plan, and you will get your house or keep the house, and everything gets fine. And 5 years later, you're all in the clear. If you have additional debt besides that, we also may have to add a little bit more in to pay at least some of that back. It kind of depends upon your situation, how much income you have, what you have in the way of assets, things of that nature. And a Chapter 13, as I mentioned, is good for someone that's behind on their mortgage, but it's also good for, say, people who have more property than the exemptions that we talked about allow you to keep, and you still want to keep it. So what they have is what's called a best interest of the creditors test, which says that as long as the creditor gets as much in the Chapter 13 as they would get in a Chapter 7 if we turned over the property that's you're not allowed to keep and distributed that, then they'll generally approve a Chapter 13 plan that pays that amount. So let's say you have an asset, I'm just make it easy, say it's a $6,000, or yeah, let's say it's a $6,000 asset, and it's not exempt. We could put a plan together where you essentially paid $100 a month for 60 months, and that would allow you to keep that asset, in the Chapter 13. Depending upon what other debt you have, what other assets you have, what kind of income you had. They look at what your income is too. If they determine what's your ability to pay. If you have the ability to pay more, then it may be more. But whatever the case, those are the answers that I can come up with in a consultation and tell you, this is likely what the outcome would be, this is what you'd probably have to do. And now you have knowledge, you have information, and you can decide from there where you want to go. So that's what happens in a Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 consult with me. It takes about an hour, and at the end of it, you have good information, which you may or may never use at all, but at least you know what your options are. So I hope this has been informative, and I thank you very much.